So welcome everyone to this AKU-ISMC talk on UK think tanks, the war on terror and the radicalisation debate. My name is Charlotte Whiting and I'm the managing editor of the occasional paper series that the Institute publishes. And it's my real pleasure today to introduce our two speakers, Hadi Enayat and Sami Zubaida. Hadi is the author of the most recent paper that we've published in our series, and he's going to talk to us about that paper in a bit more detail today. If you haven't yet had a chance to read the paper, I really urge you to take a look. It's freely available on our webpage. It's on the publications section on the ISMC website. Now, before I introduce the speakers more fully, there's just a few notes on housekeeping. Hadi's going to talk for around 20 minutes about his paper, and then he will be joined by Sami, and they will discuss some of the themes and questions that are raised by the paper in a little bit more detail. And then by the end, hopefully we'll have around 10 to 20 minutes left for questions from the audience. So please do submit your questions. We really welcome any comments or questions that you might have. It's very easy to do. Just put them in the comments section below the feed that you're watching, and then we'll pick those up and go through them. And hopefully we'll manage to get through as many of those as possible in the time that we have left. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers more fully. Hadi Enayat is an independent researcher and visiting lecturer at AKU-ISMC, and he's also a research fellow at the Foreign Policy Centre. His main research interests are in the areas of religion and international relations, sociology of law, and secularism studies. And his publications include Law, State and Society in Modern Iran, which was published in 2013, and Islam and Secularism in Post-Colonial Thought, which was published in 2017. Our second speaker is Sami Zubaida. He's an emeritus professor of politics and sociology at Birkbeck, University of London. He's a fellow of Birkbeck College and also a professorial research associate of the Food Studies Centre at SOAS. He's held various visiting positions in Cairo, Istanbul, Beirut, Aix-en-Provence, Paris, Berkeley and NYU, and has written and lectured widely on themes of religion, culture, politics, law and so forth in the Middle East. His publications, amongst many others, include Islam and People and the State, Political Ideas and Movements in the Middle East, third edition of which was published in 2009, Law and Power in the Islamic World, published in 2003, and Beyond Islam, A New Understanding of the Middle East, which was published in 2011. So Hadi, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte. And I'd like to thank ISMC for asking me to write the paper, which I enjoyed doing a lot. It gave me the chance to clarify a lot of heated issues which have featured in classroom discussions and with colleagues and friends. And also it was a useful reflective exercise as an associate fellow of the UK think tank to think about the constellation of structures and interests in which think tanks are embedded. So I'm going to read a summary of the paper out with the slides now. This paper attempts to map the discursive and ideological habitus in which UK think tanks operate in connection with the war on terror. It discusses how UK think tanks have both shaped and been shaped by this habitus and the impact their work has had on counter-terrorism policy in the UK. It does this by focusing mainly on two aspects of UK counter-terrorism policy, the war in Iraq and the controversial PREVENT programme. Huge amounts have been written about both of these issues, and the paper doesn't add any fresh ideas to these debates. But I hope that it has provided a useful map of the political terrain occupied by UK think tanks. And in discussing these issues, it's hoped that the paper will form the foundation for a number of other forthcoming ISMC working papers on Islam, think tanks and security in various European countries. Okay. So the paper starts by discussing the concept of think tanks. The term think tank was first coined in the United States during the Second World War to refer to a secure room or environment in which policymakers could meet to discuss wartime strategy. Broadly speaking, think tanks are institutions which provide public policy research and analysis and advice. In the UK, think tanks can be traced back as far as the early 19th century with the establishment in 1831 of the Royal United Services Institute, otherwise known as RUSI, which was founded by the Duke of Wellington. Today, there are over 200 think tanks in the UK, most of them small in terms of staff and with relatively moderate financial resources. As think tanks have grown in number and become more diverse, scholars have been unable to reach a consensus on exactly how to describe them. Some think tanks are charities and others private limited companies. Some focus on very specific areas such as defense or health, while others cover a wide range of policies. This has led to the construction of various typologies to account for the range of institutions that populate the think tank community. For example, according to Robert Weaver and James McGann's well-known typology, most think tanks are either of the academic or advocacy type. The former type is characterized by heavy reliance on academics and researchers and a stress on non-partisanship and objectivity. The latter type, identified by Weaver and McGann, advocacy think tanks, combine a strong ideological bent with explicit efforts to influence current policy debates. In this more ideological form, think tanks form part of what George Monbiot calls the infrastructure of persuasion, the material structures of ideology deployed by various political factions to try to gain hegemony over a polity or discourse. These advocacy think tanks rose to prominence in the 1970s as the producers of a counter-discourse to the Keynesian economic consensus. Indeed, during this period, some of them were instrumental in shifting the Overton window of British politics to the right and facilitating the establishment of a new neoliberal orthodoxy. These think tanks included the Centre for Policy Studies, the Institute for Economic Affairs, and the Adam Smith Institute. Excuse me. Fundraising is a major part of think tank life. Researchers need to be paid and overheads need to be covered. This money must be raised, and generally that involves finding sponsors for research projects, maintaining a stream of donations, and in some cases charging for membership. How does funding shape the output of the think tanks? Pressure to find funders can have a negative effect on the work of think tanks, though reputable organizations will generally not sell their skills to provide superficial, preordained research. Conversely, while funders of think tanks are not usually doing it for purely altruistic reasons, that does not necessarily mean they expect to benefit directly from a think tank that they have supported. But some think tanks are more transparent than others about their finances, and recent reports about a secretive network of libertarian and free market think tanks deliberately hiding their funding sources has confirmed all the worst stereotypes of think tanks as essentially PR agencies for various elite interests. In connection with funding and the constraints it places on think tanks, Tom Medvets has argued that, quote, think tanks must carry out a delicate balancing act that involves signaling their cognitive autonomy to a general audience, while at the same time signaling their heteronomy or willingness to subordinate their production to the demands of clients to a more restricted audience, end quote. He suggests that the comparative advantage of think tanks has been their ability and willingness to genuflect to wealthy, powerful patrons and thus monopolize what he labels the interstitial field between the academic world, the corporate sector, and public policy. Okay, then the paper turns to looking at the rise of terrorism expertise from the 1970s onwards. This part of the paper maps the shift in expert discourse about political violence from a discourse organized around insurgency to one organized around terrorism. And the main book informing this part of the article is a wonderful book by Lisa Stampnitsky called Disciplining Terrorism, which is well worth a read. So a shift from a discourse about political violence from one organized around insurgency to one organized around terrorism. Notably in the 1950s and 1960s, what are often referred to today as terrorists were referred to variously as bandits, rebels, guerrillas, or later urban revolutionaries or insurgents. This discursive shift was important because whilst counterinsurgency doctrine, with its roots in the colonial period, was characterized by extreme physical and symbolic violence, it also acknowledged the political grievances which underpinned insurgencies and at least held out the possibility of resolving or reducing political violence by attempting to address those grievances. Thus, the shift to a discourse of terrorism was important because whereas insurgents were generally assumed to be rational actors who could be countered with a similarly rational strategy of counterinsurgency, the rationality of terrorists would constantly be called into question, and they increasingly became seen as pathological evildoers without any legitimate grievances. The rise of the terrorism discourse was facilitated by a group of terrorism scholars who emerged in the late 1970s and informally referred to themselves as the terrorism mafia. These included a number of key experts, some of whom remain influential today, such as David Rappaport, Martha Crenshaw, Brian Jenkins, Paul Wilkinson, Yona Alexander, Walter Laqueur, and Ariel Merari. Institutionally, this process found expression with the creation of a terrorism program at RAND, a US think tank, headed by Brian Jenkins and funded by the United States government. This was part of the US's new counter-terrorism apparatus that was meant to provide a broad understanding of the origins, theory, strategy, and tactics of modern terrorism. With the end of the Cold War, a new discourse emerged in order to characterize, quote unquote, Islamic terrorism. This new discourse would ultimately coalesce around the framework of what became referred to by the so-called terrorism mafia as the new terrorism. Proponents of this discourse argued that the old terrorism, which predominated before the end of the Cold War, was based on secular ideology, whether of the far left or the far right, and was thus more amenable, because it was secular, to compromise, and had a strong element of rationality within it. In contrast, the new terrorism was more dangerous because it was religious, and thus based on transcendental and absolutist claims. The suicide bomber was seen as emblematic of the extreme danger and irrationality posed by this new terrorism. This discourse derived a great many of its core assumptions and narratives from the long tradition of Orientalist scholarship on Islam and the Middle East. This literature expanded in academia as well as in popular culture in response to the tumultuous events in the Middle East, such as the 1972 Munich massacre, the 1979 American embassy hostage crisis in Iran, the Rushdie affair, and the terrorist kidnappings and hijackings of the 1980s. Even though it was challenged by an anti-Orientalist discourse largely inspired by Edward Said's book Orientalism of 1978, it was boosted by the 9/11 attacks and found expression in the writings of Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis, amongst others. In response to the rise of terror expertise, a body of critical terrorism studies has emerged to critique existing research on terrorism and its political effects. This includes scholars such as Yaron Gunning, Richard Jackson, and Arun Kundani. Employing a Gramscian perspective, these scholars have argued that what they call orthodox terrorism experts, mainly referring to the terrorism mafia, function as organic intellectuals, intimately connected institutionally, financially, politically, and ideologically with the state hegemonic project of manufacturing consent for projects like the War on Terror. They have argued that there are a number of reasons why a critical turn within terrorism studies is necessary. These include the dominance of state-centric problem-solving approaches within terrorism studies, and the close ideological and organizational association of key researchers with state institutions. Scholars working within the critical terrorism studies current also challenge the distinction between the old and the new terrorism and widen their understanding of terrorism to include state terrorism, a concept largely neglected or rejected by orthodox terrorism studies. Okay, the article then turns to looking at UK think tanks and their positions on various aspects of the War on Terror. This part of the paper looks at a small sample of some of the larger, well-endowed UK think tanks, with the exception of Claystone, which is very small. I'm not even sure if Claystone still exists, actually. Categorizing them using the designations orthodox conservative think tanks, establishment think tanks, and radical alternative think tanks. I grappled a lot about how to categorize these think tanks, and I'm still a little conflicted about the typology I've used. It was tempting to use the conventional left-right distinction, but this seemed inadequate as the issues surrounding the War on Terror, such as racism, Islam, multiculturalism, and the causes of radicalization, do not map neatly onto the left-right spectrum in UK politics. So the first category, orthodox conservative think tanks. These are think tanks which have generally hewn most closely to what critical terrorism studies scholars refer to as orthodox terrorism studies. That's why I used the term orthodox to describe them. Think tanks in this category include the Quillian Foundation, the Henry Jackson Society, and Policy Exchange. Whilst there are divergent views within these think tanks and the dominant narrative expounded by them is that the United States and its allies are at war with Islamism, which is waging an essentially political war against Western values or the Western way of life. In this narrative, terrorists are irrational, motivated primarily by religious dogmatism and hatred, and thus implacable and unscrupulous. Thus, given the nature and scale of the threat, the terrorists must be met with aggressive military action abroad and repressive policies at home. Moreover, these think tanks have tended to subscribe, implicitly or explicitly, to the so-called conveyor belt theory of radicalization, that Islamist ideology mechanically pushes a person towards violent extremism. The antidote to the totalitarian ideology of Islamism is de-radicalization programs such as PREVENT, according to this view, and the promotion of more liberal and spiritual forms of Islam. These think tanks also tend to be critical of multiculturalism as a set of policies which has encouraged separatism and nurtured cultures which do not respect British values. The second category, establishment think tanks. These think tanks are closer to the centre of the UK political spectrum than the previous ones. They are very much part of the establishment foreign policy community. In this category are think tanks such as Chatham House, RUSI, the Foreign Policy Centre, at which I'm an associate fellow, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Like the previous category we have considered, they have over the years both drawn from and contributed to the central paradigms of what I've called, or of what critical terrorism studies scholars call orthodox terrorism studies. In doing so, however, they have often accommodated a more divergent range of opinions than the conservative-orthodox think tanks discussed above. Generally speaking, they have given cautious support to central aspects of the war on terror, such as the invasion of Afghanistan, while at the same time expressing criticism of specific aspects of it, such as the Iraq War and sometimes the PREVENT program. And then the third category that I used are alternative radical think tanks. These are think tanks which challenge aspects of or completely reject the dominant assumptions of orthodox terrorism studies and draw off many of the ideas in the critical terrorism studies literature. They are more closely aligned with the left wing of British politics, but also sometimes with Islamist groups in the UK. They include Demos, Claystone, the Islamic Human Rights Commission, CAGE, and Muslim Engagement and Development, otherwise known as MEND. They tend to advocate alternative understandings of the causes of terrorism, such as injustice, poverty, or racism. They might also seek to portray terrorists as rational actors motivated by political grievances and warn against military action or the curtailment of civil liberties. They generally defend multiculturalism and emphasize racism and Islamophobia, as well as UK foreign policy as the main drivers of radicalization, whilst downplaying the importance of Islamist ideology. They are also highly critical of the UK government's PREVENT program and have called for its complete dismantling. Okay, so to the conclusion. What impact have these think tanks had on foreign and domestic policy in connection with counter-terrorism in the UK? While it's difficult to say without further research what the causal relations between think tank reporting and policy processes is, it seems reasonable to assert that after 9/11, neoconservative think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society dominated the discourse on the causes of terrorism and the appropriate response to them on both sides of the Atlantic. For the neoconservatives who dominated US policymaking on counterterrorism in the early years of the war on terror, terrorism was seen as a product of Islamic culture. Scholars like Bernard Lewis, a key advisor on the Middle East to the George W. Bush administration, argued that Islam had a cultural propensity towards totalitarian rejections of modernity. This anti-modernism ran so deep in the culture of the Middle East that only war could overturn it and inaugurate a cultural and political transformation of the region. Whilst he expressed his foreign policy positions in the liberal language of humanitarian intervention, Tony Blair, I would argue, accepted much of this neoconservative analysis, and his support for the 2003 war in Iraq rested, partly at least, on this basis. By 2005, when the disastrous consequences of the Iraq War had become apparent, counter-terrorism policymakers were looking for new theories that could help them understand how to prevent bombings carried out by European citizens, such as those that took place in Madrid in 2004 and in London in 2005. At this point, the concept of radicalization, quote unquote, became central to the emerging models of the causes of terrorism in national security circles. Broadly speaking, the radicalization debate has been divided into two camps. What I've called idealists and materialists. The former, represented by think tanks like Quilliam, Policy Exchange, and Henry Jackson Society, have emphasized ideology in the form of radical Islam as the key to understanding radicalization. In addition, as we have seen, they have sometimes emphasized the divisive effects of multiculturalism and the lack of adherence to British values as encouraging terrorism. The latter camp, represented more by think tanks like Rusi, Dimos, and Claystone, have emphasized material or situational factors like grievances over foreign policy and racism, social networks, and group and organizational dynamics more than ideological and religious factors. Addressing some of these grievances, as well as understanding the dynamics of these networks and organizations, is seen as key to countering terrorism. But these are not mutually exclusive approaches, and some voices from within these think tanks, such as Raffaello Pantucci from Rusi and Aaron Kundani from Claystone, have argued for a holistic multi-causal explanation for the turn to violent extremism, which incorporates both ideological and material factors. Indeed, I argue in the conclusion that it is impossible to completely disentangle the material and the ideological, and that they are mutually constituted. Thus, whilst material events and experiences clearly have autonomy from their ideological and discursive articulations, they are at the same time interpreted and given meaning through such frameworks. Jihadi ideology, for example, promotes a powerful narrative of blame, that the West, led by the United States, is engaged in a vast joined-up conspiracy to destroy Islam. This narrative, itself a synthesis of a brutally literalist and ahistorical reading of the foundational Islamic texts, synthesized with a Manichean Occidentalist political vision, is twisted and largely divorced from reality. Nevertheless, any sensible response to 9/11 should have aimed at unraveling and weakening the credibility of such a narrative. Instead, by invading Iraq, the US and its allies corroborated a central proposition in the jihadist narrative of blame, namely that Americans feel contempt for Muslims and ascribe little or no value to Muslim lives. The Trump presidency and its racist language and its policies towards Muslims has also strengthened this kind of narrative, as have arguably programs like Prevent. In terms of influencing government policy, the idealists have largely won out in this debate, and the public face of the UK counter-terrorism policy continues to be the controversial Prevent programme. Indeed, successive governments have consistently denied the causal links between UK foreign policy and radicalisation. There are some indications, however, that the intelligence services in the UK have acknowledged the role of political grievances in exacerbating the threat of international terrorism. For example, the former head of MI5, Dame Eliza Manningham-Buller, underlined this position in a speech in 2006, as did Stella Rimington, another former head of MI5, in an interview with The Guardian in 2008. Indeed, according to Rimington, these views were widely held among the intelligence services. Ultimately, the evidence that we have shows that there's no single pathway or motivation for the turn to jihadi militancy. And this is confirmed by the 30 biographical data sets of jihadi militants worldwide, which show a wide range of motivations, including religious beliefs, the desire to establish a caliphate, geopolitical grievances, racism, and criminality. It is hoped that the forthcoming papers in this series will throw more light on these debates from perspectives outside of the UK, as well as on the efficacy of de-radicalisation models, which may have been less punitive and divisive than the UK's current Prevent programme, which is at the moment the subject of a public inquiry. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, Sami, if you'd like to go ahead.
Right. Well, thank you, Hadi. That I much enjoyed reading the paper and listening to your exposition of it, and it's a masterly effort, general survey, close survey of the think tank in relation to terrorism scene in this country. And I have, very little. I don't have any disagreement with anything that you've said, but I have some elaboration on one or 2 points. And to start with the question of the causes of terrorism and what you quite aptly call the materialist versus the idealist school, the conditions that give rise to terrorism on the one hand, and the emphasis on the ideology itself as a causative factor in stimulating terrorism. In favor of the materialist approach, I would point to a really interesting phenomenon, which is that so many of the terrorists who in Europe, and particularly in France and in Britain, who were arrested and imprisoned, it transpires that many of them did not have much of a grasp of Islam and very little knowledge of the Quran or the canonical sources. And so to say that they're motivated by Islamic ideology is a little bit far-fetched in this respect, because they don't have much knowledge of Islam. At the same time, many of those people were actually, in terms of their personal lives, not exactly a model of Islamic observance. So many of the people, especially in France and Belgium, who were arrested, were actually petty criminals who were very much involved in drugs and drug smuggling and alcohol and sex, all the things that are forbidden in strict Islamic observance. So in this respect, then, it would seem that the actual religiosity and the conviction in religion were not important factors for these people. But on the other hand, the idea of Islam being under attack and Islam versus the West, a kind of antagonistic attitude towards their societies in which they live. So in this respect, I would point to the work of the French sociologist Olivier Roy, who had written extensively on the question of Islamic radicalism, on political Islam. And one of his arguments in this respect is that it's not so much Muslims being radicalized, it is much more radicals being Islamized. So in this respect, these mostly young men and women who are engaged in petty criminality and so on, they are kind of in a dissident position in relation to societies and cultures in which they live. And so Islam then becomes Islamic radicalism, becomes a means of reasserting their antagonism to the societies in which they live and the regimes to which they are subjected. Also, part of this is what you might call the quest for excitement. That so many of these young men and women are in dead-end situations, in they are poor, they are unemployed, or they are they have very limited and limiting lives. And so the prospect of activism, which is oppositional and sanctified by religion, seems quite attractive. And I was particularly struck in this respect by the young women, schoolgirls, in fact, from somewhere in the Midlands in Britain or the North, who then went to join ISIS in Syria, and what the correspondence that followed from it. And it seemed that, this quest for excitement, the quest to transcend the limitations of their very limited lives and life chances, was an important element in the decision to join the Islamic State and to engage in the fight against the West. So that's on the question of the causes of radicalism, terrorism. To come to the classification of the think tanks, which I think is very well done and very well argued. But on the other hand, as bound to happen, there are sort of some niggling doubts about some of the classification. So when you are looking at the orthodox classification, and you put the Quillen Foundation together with these Henry Jackson and Policy Exchange. And Henry Jackson and Policy Exchange seem to be straightforward, very conservative, neoliberal, engaged in right-wing politics. Quillen Foundation doesn't seem to fit quite into that same category, and in particular, Nawaz, whose analysis, as you say, is certainly tends to the question, prioritizing ideology and prioritizing radicalization by ideology, but at the same time, it recognizes the kind of chain of grievances, of recruitment, of and recruiters in a way which seems to parallel some of the characters in the other classes, like your establishment class, so Rusi, for instance, and their analyst Pantucci. There seems to be some overlap between Pantucci and Nawaz. Nawaz seems to be out of the class of all the Michael Goves and all the conservative characters in the other two ones that you classify as orthodox. And then we come to Chatham House, and you give a very good account of the opposition to the Iraq War by one particular Chatham House intellectual, who's Toby Dodge. And that's a very good account, and it's interesting in that respect. But somehow the implication for terrorism studies is not drawn out. And whether this was all that Chatham House was doing at the time, I remember I was involved in some of their meetings after the 9/11 and the big debates on terrorism, and there were very varied viewpoints there and debates, which is perhaps not entirely represented by the question of the Iraq War and its consequences. Although, of course, the Iraq War and its consequences were crucial in the motivations for radicalism, Islamism, and including the terrorism. Now, the one, that's really mostly what I want to say, but I think one of the, would all agree that one of the sort of crucial media which facilitated all kinds of communications and recruitment and so on is through the internet and social media. And I don't know, apart from pointing it out, there isn't very much more I can say about it. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. There's a lot there. And I'll try and respond to all of it. We haven't got too much time left, but yeah, I think that Olivier Roy's characterization of the radicalization of Islam is a very useful one. I mean, many of the people that end up in these organizations, especially the younger generation, I think, are already radicalized. They're already radicalized, they're already, well, he uses the term radicalization quite broadly, but, they've either turned to criminality or they've turned to, gangsterism and things like that. And they find in the kind of jihadi ideology and the kind of, the image and the very, very powerful social media, sophisticated social media kind of program of ISIS, something which draws them in, kind of thing. And many of them had, very, they were irreligious, Having said that, I don't think we should discount, the role of ideology as a kind of force multiplier and a kind of lightning rod, which can, push, turn people into violent extremists as well, further down the line. So, yeah, I mean, quite often the starting point is not religion or religious ideology. It comes later on, but that can have a very, very important effect. I mean, there's no one-size-fits-all trajectory. Sometimes religious ideology seems to come in earlier in the biography of, of the turn, or in the trajectory of the turn to violent radicalism. I mean, like I said, these data sets, which are available online, most of them, 30 biographical data sets of global jihadis, paint a very, very inconsistent picture. There's just no one-size-fits-all explanation kind of thing. Sometimes religion seems to play, a very important role early on in a person's life kind of thing, or in their kind of turn to violent extremism. And then sometimes it plays a much more kind of post-facto role. The other impression I get is that there's quite a difference between the slightly older generation of jihadis, who joined Al-Qaeda in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, who I think were more political kind of thing, more politically motivated, political stroke religiously motivated. And the younger generation of people who joined ISIS, who obviously, for all sorts of reasons, some of them political, but many of them, as you say, for like the excitement, the so-called five-star jihad, as it was one jihadi. And I think that's something which is more prevalent within this younger generation of jihadis which joined ISIS. So I think we're in the third or fourth generation of the kind of jihadi movement, if we trace it back to the war in Afghanistan. The classification. I agree. I mean, it's questionable, and the lines between them are blurred, and Quilliam certainly has one foot at least in the establishment camp. By virtue also, you could say, of being very close to the establishment. I mean, Quilliam for a few years received government funding, I think from 2009 to 2011, to implement the PREVENT program. So it was effectively a quasi-governmental think tank. So in that respect, perhaps it belongs in the second category, establishment, but also because of the causes, as you mentioned. It's not so reductive, or at least Nawaz in his book, which he wrote with Sam Harris, whose title I forget, is not so reductive in terms of reducing this all to kind of ideology. He does point to multiple factors, though I have to say their emphasis is on the ideological, and rather than what I've called the material. What was the next one? Oh yeah, Chatham House. Yeah, I mean, someone from Chatham House actually contacted me who'd read the article and said, there was a range of views on Iraq. Most people, most of the people working at Chatham House were opposed to the Iraq War, but there were some dissenting voices about that. How does that link to this paper? I mean, yes, it needed, I think, integrating into the paper a little bit more. But I mean, the way I understand it is the Iraq War was a component of counter-terrorism, was a component of the war on terror kind of thing. And that's why I included it in this discussion, using mainly Toby Dodge. Toby Dodge has been, and Toby Dodge had the ear, at least for a while, in one or two meetings of Tony Blair, I think. There was a famous kind of episode of the so-called Six Wise Men, the 6 academics who met with...
Which Blair rejected.
Blair completely rejected it, yeah. There was another one, I think, another question. Oh, the internet, of course, yeah. I mean, that's a very, very important, especially with the current, generation, with the ISIS and post-ISIS generation. The internet both as a kind of, an instrument of re-tribalizing society, rather than something which is kind of cosmopolitan and bringing people together through its interconnectivity, is kind of divided in many ways, and turned, fractured society in many ways. But at the same time, it's also facilitated, networking in a way which wasn't possible before, which is a very, very important part of, I think, understanding the dynamics of violent extremism. I didn't come across a great deal of that in the papers that I was restricted to basically what was available online. That was the other thing. Sometimes things were behind paywalls. They may have discussed this, some of these institutions, but I was restricted to what was there available online, and there wasn't much about that. There's a lot more to say about this issue. Gender, for example, is a very important dimension of understanding, extremism. And that wasn't discussed in any of the think tanks I looked at, though there is some very good work done on gender and jihad by the International Crisis Group, which is a think tank which I didn't include in this study, which maybe I should have done, because they produce some very, very interesting work. I mean, strictly speaking, they're not a British think tank. They're based in Brussels and they're international, but they've done some very good work on gender and jihad, on the gender dimensions of these organizations. So anyway, I'll stop there because we need some time for questions, I think, if there are any. I don't know whether there are.
Well, let's wait and see what comes through, but we already have a comment that's come through on what Sami was saying, which you've partially already addressed, Hadi, but I'll ask it anyway. It's come from Mehdi Askaria, and he's asking, Sami, don't Quilliam have a very conservative view?
Sorry, say that again.
So Mehdi Askaria is asking, Sami, don't Quilliam have a very conservative view in relation to what you said about their classification?
Yes, I don't claim any close familiarity with any of these. I'm just following Hadi, really. And as far as I can see, yeah, they are conservative, but they are conservative, it seems to me, in a different way from these, extreme right, other think tanks that Hadi put under the orthodox category. But yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that they seem to be not quite in that mold. But I haven't really much more to add on that.
Okay. Hadi, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of their liberal, it's very difficult how that, imagine ran for the Liberal Democrat Party, I think, as a candidate somewhere in London. So he describes himself as a liberal. He's a very proud liberal, Perhaps you could say they're conservative leaning liberals on some things and then, more squarely liberal on others. In terms of their explanation for the causes of terrorism, like I say, they hew quite closely to what I've called here orthodox terrorism studies, but they do also recognize multiple causes. So they're kind of somewhere in between in terms of their, you know, their explanations of the causes and effects of terrorism. In terms of where they're situated, like I say, they could go in the second category because they were at least very close to the establishment. I don't think they received any state funding anymore. So there's some, you know, they're somewhere in between, I think, the first two categories.
Okay, thank you. So while we wait for some other questions to come through, I have one myself. And it was thinking through that in your paper you talk about the efficacy of alternative de-radicalization models and alternatives to the PREVENT program, for example. And you have some interesting suggestions that speak to this. So Kundlani's safe spaces for discussion and Briggs's co-creation of security by a wider range of actors and so forth. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about this. I mean, are there other models and proposals, or are there others perhaps already even functioning? I just found that an interesting aspect of the paper. And
yeah, it is interesting, and I don't know too much about it, to be honest. I was hoping that some of the other papers in this working, because I think there's going to be a couple more maybe about these issues of security. And you know, what I've read is that there are different approaches. You know, all of the European countries have some kind of quote unquote de-radicalization program, but some of them are less punitive and more community based than the British government's PREVENT program, which seems to be particularly punitive. It does also have a community dimension to it as well. There are all kinds of community activists involved in it and things like that. So yeah, we hope to learn from future papers about perhaps more community-based approaches, you know, which have managed to gain the trust of local communities more than PREVENT. I mean, there's a huge debate about PREVENT. I mean, you know, on the one side, you have the defenders of PREVENT saying that its name has been tarnished deliberately by extremists within the British Muslim community who tried to depict it as a kind of spying on Muslims kind of thing, and racist and discriminatory. And defenders of PREVENT say that that's wrong, and that in fact it has more support in the UK Muslim community than is sometimes depicted, and that there's been lots of successes. I mean, one figure I saw by a PREVENT officer said that, we've deflected over 1,000 people away from potential acts of terrorism. I've no idea whether that's true. And of course, critics of PREVENT, and I think the critics are more numerous and they're more prolific, and you can find, you know, lots of articles by, you know, again, community activists, professionals, social workers, teachers, very, very critical of the PREVENT program, of its this kind of securitization of Muslims in a way which has been very, very divisive, discriminatory, and ultimately counterproductive. And that's why there's been this public inquiry called into it, which was due to report last summer, but which has been delayed because of COVID, I assume. So it'll be interesting to see that inquiry, and to have some comparative work. There is comparative work done on this programs. I just haven't read it yet properly.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you raised that issue around community embedded research, because it's something I kind of wondered about, if there was, you know, sort of links to what Briggs was talking about as well, the wider range of actors who could contribute, and you know, whether a grassroots think tank, you know, where some of the communities that we're talking about when we talk about radicalization can sort of be part of the knowledge generation and amplifying their voices. I don't know, it's just interesting that you raised that now as well. So yeah.
Well, because Demos did that paper on that, but they didn't give any examples. It's a bit frustrating. So they kind of raised it in theory almost.
Yeah.
That particular paper by Briggs, and it's really interesting. But then there's no examples in the paper as far as I can see. Referring to examples of that in Britain or in other places. In fact, it doesn't mention PREVENT at all, I don't think, in that paper. Was PREVENT perhaps not running, but that's quite that paper was written in the 2000s. But perhaps PREVENT wasn't up and running then. Anyway,
okay.
Interesting one. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a few sort of comments and questions that are coming through here, so I'll just take these in order. So Mustafa is asking, what is the future of the jihadi groups?
Wow.
Yeah, big question.
Big question.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so, it depends which ones you're talking about. I mean, I think for the time being, it's something that's just going to go up and down, actually, for quite some time. I don't think it's ever going to completely disappear. And at the moment, I think with the defeat of the destruction of the caliphate in Syria, this, ISIS, at least, which is only one jihadi group, is a very, very important one. There are lots of other ones. Has taken, a moral and kind of, existential blow, but it hasn't disappeared, and the conditions which gave rise to it are still very much there. And you hear that they're starting to come back in parts of Syria and Iraq. But I think the kind of the status they had as a kind of caliphate was something, the power which they projected, kind of thing, and especially through their social media and the actual territory and resources which they controlled, was a very, very important thing in attracting people into this. And that's gone in terms of ISIS. But of course, ISIS is not the only, there are ISIS affiliated groups in other parts of the world, in Africa, and then Al-Qaeda affiliated groups as well. They're still there. So I don't know what the future is. I mean, it's like I say, I think it's going to be a roller coaster, and I think it's going to, yes, it will depend on the future of the political, politics of the Middle East, whether there can be some kind of sustainable, legitimate state formation and state building out of this kind of chaos in both Syria and Iraq. If that can happen, if inclusive states can be built in both those countries, then the kind of narrative which attracts people, into these organizations, not just the narrative, but sometimes, like I say, the opportunities which are given to them by these very kind of exclusive sectarian states, quasi-failed states in Syria and Iraq, are the perfect breeding ground for this kind of organization. So until there's kind of legitimate, just government for all groups, there's always going to be constituencies for this phenomenon, I think. And there's a similar story in parts of Africa where states have half collapsed or they're very weak. And it's in those regions where these groups tend to thrive. Yeah, I don't know whether you want to say something, Sami.
Well, yeah, no, I agree. I think the sort of collapse of the state and state control in so many different parts of the Middle East and Africa has been a very important factor. Of course, how could ISIS, with far fewer men, conquer the Iraqi army and take the most important city of Mosul in a kind of flash raid, just like that? Because the Iraqi army was sort of hollow from the inside because of corruption and all kinds of weakening factors to do with the collapsing, with the weakness of the state and the corruption of the politicians. So in fact, this phenomenon, which you find, as you say, Iraq and Syria, and don't forget Libya and Afghanistan, they're very important, not just for the countries themselves, but for the kind of international scene and the possibility of developing these radical terrorist movements elsewhere.
Okay, we've got a couple of additional questions here, one on gender and another one on university campuses. So I'll take the gender one first. This is from Shireen. I don't know of any major think tanks that specifically speak to the concerns of young women, particularly around the type of issues that draw young women into organizations like Daesh. Are there any, and if not, why not? Say something about that.
Question. Well, I think, as I said, the International Crisis Group does work on gender and conflict. Azad Emoaveni is the head of their gender and conflict section. So I think they, if you want to find out more about that, to look at their their work. Yeah, but generally speaking, it's not a very gendered subject. It obviously it needs to be, because it's a very, very important dimension of understanding these movements. But I would highly recommend Azad Emoaveni's book on ISIS, on female members of the ISIS organization.
Do you think there's an element of class as well? So somebody else asked a similar question to the gender one, but they also asked about class, if that, how that intersects.
Yeah, I mean, most of these analyses that I've looked at downplay the role of class, at least in understanding the turn to violent extremism, what's often called radicalization in the West, that quite often the people that join these movements aren't from particularly deprived backgrounds. Some of them are, but many of them, perhaps most of them, aren't actually. I mean, it's a very complicated picture, and thus it seems to be all sorts of other factors which are kind of attracting them into these movements. Identity crises, anger over foreign policy, experiences of racism. Not so much class. I mean, I think the dynamics driving people inside, say, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, why would someone join one of these movements or go and fight for them inside those countries, has a very much stronger, class element to it, in the sense that some of these people basically had no other choice. They had no money, so joining ISIS and it actually gave them an income to some of these people. And ISIS for a while, had a state or proto-state of sorts in Iraq and Syria, and there was a measure of law and order and security and what have you, and some people at least half accepted this and supported this because it gave them some security. So yeah, I think the class dimension is a factor. Like I say, most of the studies show it isn't the major factor drawing people in Europe. But perhaps more in the Middle East, in countries like Syria, Iraq, what have you, there is a bigger class dimension to understanding, the membership and the constituencies of these movements. Would you say so?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yes, certainly. But in terms of gender, of course, so many of the victims of terrorism and the radical movements like ISIS are women, and especially when you see, the terrible, tragic cases of the Yazidi community in Iraq under ISIS, and the way in which the enslavement of women and girls is really very, very kind of striking, tragic situation. So, but that's of course quite distinct from the recruitment of women and girls into into ISIS itself, which of course there are many different situations and motivations, but I don't know.
Okay. So now we're going to move on to a question from Mehdi. He asks, Hadi, how successful has Prevent been in university campuses?
Wow, it's a really good question. I mean, I can only talk about, reports I've read in the media. Mostly have been negative. There's been a very, very divisive, program in universities and in schools, which many students have opposed, and has made them feel like they're not in a safe space or whatever. So something. This is the thing about that if you express a view which is deemed radical, quote unquote, and that can mean anything from, I mean, that's very, very subjective. The teacher makes a decision about that, but it can mean anything from expressing support for I don't know, Hamas, or to expressing, to support for, I don't know, Frantz Fanon even, or even teaching Frantz Fanon or Said Qutb or something in a certain way in the classroom. it's generally been quite a negative impact there, which, according to, has kind of restricted freedom of speech inside the universities. Again, I don't know. There are defenders of Prevent, as I mentioned. One of the officers high up in Prevent. There are cases where they claim to have turned people away. Many cases from potential acts of terror. Maybe some of those were students. I don't know.
Well, I think it's in the context of schools and universities. It's sinister.
Yeah.
This kind of surveillance, and also, asking teachers to report on their students. I mean, this is really sinister. I don't know what actually is happening. I haven't followed what, but the very idea of it is, surely it has to be rejected by any kind of liberal freedom of speech, freedom of education.
Absolutely, yeah. Pretty negative, I think.
Okay, so we also have, again, looking at the time, perhaps this should be our last question. We have a question from Mahmoud, and he asks how closely the UK think tanks are influenced or dictated by other hegemonic powers in formulating their country's policies, especially the recent issues of return of ISIS militants from Syria and Iraq in the UK.
Wow. Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, in terms of the influence of US money and governmental, influence, or US think tank influence, the Henry Jackson Society was itself originally a US, it is a US think tank, which set up a wing over here, and which is, registered charity, but I think it's very, very well endowed. And some of its funders are American. Funding doesn't necessarily determine exactly what's in the think tank's output, but I think it does kind of constrain that. And Henry Jackson has been probably the most ideological of all of these think tanks in terms of the war on terror. Sorry, in terms of returning, so I'm not sure how to answer the case of Shamima Begum, which is an interesting one, and then intersects with that gender case. I think the International Crisis Group have been writing or reporting, or at least giving interviews about that issue of the return of Shamima Begum to the UK, which was at first rejected, and which, as I understand it now, might be happening, I think. So what has been the positions of the other think tanks on that? I'm not sure. I haven't followed that, but like I say, in terms of US influence, corporate money, and think tank influence, the main, or one of the kind of routes into the UK, as I say, is the Henry Jackson Society. Yeah, I don't know if you know anything about that, Sami.
No, I don't. No.
Okay. So we had one comment which I thought was worth reading out, which was in relation to why women joined ISIS. It's somebody recommending a book called Guest House for Young Widows by Azadeh Mwaveni, which is a very accessible and a good account of how and why young women joined ISIS, but not how to address their concerns. And that comes from Shireen, from the original question came from. Yeah.
This book from International Crisis Group. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that was worth mentioning. Yeah.
I've got it. I haven't read it yet, but I've read another one of her books, which I like very much. She's very good. So it's probably well worth reading.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think given that it's now almost 1:10, it's probably time to wrap up. So thank you so much to both of our speakers. It was really interesting, and well, I've worked closely with you on the paper, Hadi, so I really enjoyed going through some of the points in a bit more detail. And thank you, Sami, for providing a really interesting discussion of some of the points as well. So with that, I think we'll end here. Thank you both very much.
Okay,
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.